Do you think that effective negotiation only requires a well-developed plan? After watching 12 Angry Men, our group realized that multi-party negotiation is especially complex. Therefore, we developed a special spectrum analysis to help negotiators keep track of all the variables that need their attention during a negotiation.
As you can see depicted in this diagram, we have identified the role of each juror to help easier identification of them. Juror number 1 is the football coach. Juror number 2 is the bank teller. Juror number 3 is the unstable gentleman. Juror number 4 is the broker. Juror number 5 is the empathetic. Juror number 6 is the blue collar. Juror number 7 is the salesman. Juror number 8 plays the role of the architect protagonist. Juror number 9 is the old man. Juror number 10 is the bigot. Juror number 11 is the watchmaker. And juror number 12 is the ad man.
This is our spectrum, which helps to visualize the focus of our paper. We stressed negotiating with the individuals that you are part of the negotiation with, and also that settlement is only possible when you bring individuals into the potential zone for agreement, which is when interests overlap. All individuals that are part of the negotiation can be plotted along the spectrum. It's not just the zone for potential agreement. Our spectrum extends to the right to obstinance. It's very difficult to negotiate with somebody who only believes in their own opinions. On the other side, to the left, we have indifference, because if somebody doesn't care, they don't have any reason to be part of the negotiation in the first place. Next, we will look at the anatomy of negotiation, and after we discuss that, we'll actually use the spectrum that we've developed to discuss and to plot what happens and occurs during the 12 Angry Men jury room negotiation.
Before we go on to explore the specifics of the negotiation in 12 Angry Men, it's important to establish that there are situations when you shouldn't negotiate, or understand the fact that negotiation is often optional. Choosing to negotiate is based on the fact as to whether you determine there is an equitable outcome possible. For example, if we look hypothetically, the 11 jurors could have chosen to not listen to Juror 8, and this would have resulted in a hung jury, or forcing Juror 8 to change to a guilty verdict. There's also other situations when there's excessive risk or nothing to negotiate, when demands are unethical, when there is a very severe time constraint, when there's lack of trust, or when there is no preparation. These are the situations when perhaps it's advised that you shouldn't negotiate. Next, we'll begin to dissect all the different variables that Juror 8 needed to consider as he worked to persuade the other jurors in our spectrum analysis.
This is our initial spectrum analysis of what happened in the jury room during 12 Angry Men. This particular snapshot of the negotiation takes place between the first two votes. The first vote when everybody voted guilty and only one person raised his hand, and the second vote. Here you'll see that the one who voted not guilty is separate from the rest of the group, which is relatively closely clumped together. But it is possible, even within that first snapshot, to separate some of the individuals out. You'll see that there is a group of 3 which are placed further to the right. Those individuals were either speaking about the case or were making statements that were a bit biased when the jurors were standing around. For example, Juror 3 talks about smacking children down before they make trouble, and the Juror 10 mentions those people. The jurors furthest to the left seemed to talk about stuff that had nothing to do with the trial, such as the ad man talking about the things that he does during a case. Juror number 7 is very interested in the baseball game, and we placed juror number 5 closer to the left because in the term between the two votes, he chooses to pass when it's his opportunity to explain why he thinks why the boy is guilty. The rest or other 5 jurors are placed kind of in the middle because they think the boy is guilty or they vote the boy as guilty, but they're not really sure why it is that they think he's guilty.
The next thing we're going to look at is the basic anatomy of a negotiation. It's important to understand that without conflict, there's no necessity for a negotiation to take place. So as we see in 12 Angry Men, Juror 8 has a different opinion in the verdict and they need to reach a consensus, so it's necessary to negotiate. It's just to make a special note, if parties cannot work civilly, trust is likely not possible, and therefore the route that may be advised is to not negotiate. But this is not the case in this situation. The second phase of negotiation is give or take, or bargaining phase, where there's a mutual adjustment by both parties, and each party is trying to convince the other of their interests and trying to persuade them to align with theirs. In an integrative negotiation, this becomes the enlarge the pie proposition, where it's necessary to understand values and interests. Once parties have worked together to reach a proposition that satisfies both parties or aligns both their interests, this is a zone of potential agreement or when a resolution can be reached.
In the diagram shown here, it is depicted as what many believe is the turning point within the movie. This diagram represents how some members of the jury are becoming more open-minded and wanting to discuss the matter at hand. This also depicts how some of the other jurors are even moving further away from the agreement. This is where some of the jurors team up with juror number 8, or the architect protagonist, to kind of understand what is more happening with the situation. Such as juror number 11, the watchmaker, asks questions to the other members of the jury. The watchmaker finds a few holes in the prosecution and areas of evidence that cannot be true. The watchmaker tries to get opinions from the other members in the jury. The watchmaker eventually changes his vote from guilty to not guilty because there is a reasonable doubt within his mind. This is where juror number 3, also known as the unstable gentleman, gets up and demands to know why juror number 11 or the watchmaker changed his vote. The unstable gentleman is going further and further away from an agreement. The unstable gentleman refuses to listen to the other members of the jury, which leads to more frustration and disagreement amongst the jurors. The jury still needs to find out what kind of verdict they will come up with at this point. In the diagram depicted here, it shows the position of the jurors just prior to a settlement or an agreement of a not guilty or guilty verdict. This diagram depicts the 9 jurors that are in the zone of a potential agreement, as well as the 1 juror who is still indifferent, and the 2 jurors that are obstinate. The juror that is indifferent is the salesman, or juror number 7. The salesman is indifferent because he does not care to be there at all. The salesman is worried about the baseball game that he plans on attending that night. The salesman does not care the outcome of the case, whether it be guilty or not guilty. The 2 obstinate jurors are juror number 3, or the unstable gentleman, and juror number 10, or the bigot. The unstable gentleman has issues with kids in the range of the defendant. The unstable gentleman had issues with his son, which makes him have personal issues towards the defendant as well. And that is why he will not change his vote to not guilty. Juror number 10, or the bigot, is still obstinate because he has a prejudice or personal preconceived thought on the defendant.
This is our final spectrum analysis. It's an analysis that occurs after all of the jurors, for one reason or another, have been convinced to vote for a not guilty verdict. It didn't look like it was going to happen for a while. As discussed in the previous slide, jurors 3 and juror 10 were being quite obstinate, and it looked like they might hold up the decision and that the case might end as a hung jury. But the old man helped in the last bit. He played a bit of negotiation jujitsu, and he identified eyeglasses. And this was able to call the lady's eyesight into question, which left reasonable doubt in the minds of pretty much everybody that was part of the jury. So everybody is finally able to come into the zone for potential agreement. Also, we had the salesman on the opposite end who didn't want to be there in the first place. He traveled through the zone of potential agreement. In our basic simple analysis, this is good enough in this situation for him to also join the party in the zone for potential agreement. Now, it is our opinion that he's just going to ride along with the majority vote since he doesn't want to be there. Whatever gets him out quickest will be his vote. If somehow jurors 3, jurors 4, or juror 10 were able to get everybody to start flipping back to a guilty verdict, we're highly likely that he would flip his vote and he would vote guilty again just in order to get out of there as soon as possible. It is at this final point, though, that with everybody in the zone for potential agreement, that a mutually satisfying settlement has been reached for each member of the jury individually for individual reasons, like the salesman who's getting to leave, or the broker who knows about the dots on your nose. Everybody's individual interests at this point has been satisfied. They overlap, they're in the zone for a potential agreement, and they agree upon the settlement of a not guilty verdict.
To conclude, it's important to understand that negotiators are people first, and that often plans and tactics alone are not enough. People also have emotions and perceptions and other intangibles that affect a negotiation. A successful negotiation includes a plan that you have made, fact-finding or researching, studying the other party, and adjusting as the negotiation evolves to reach an appropriate settlement or resolution. I'd like to leave you with a quote from 12 Angry Men that really summarizes what the film was about and the negotiation aspect within the film. It is always difficult to keep personal prejudice out of a thing like this, and wherever you run into it, prejudice always obscures the truth. I don't really know what the truth is. I don't suppose anybody will ever really know. 9 of us now seem to feel that the defendant is innocent, but we're just gambling on probabilities. We may be wrong. We may be trying to let a guilty man go free. I don't know. Nobody really can. But we have reasonable doubt, and that's something that's very valuable in our system. No jury can declare a man guilty unless it's sure.